So in yesterday's web dev tip, we started looking at generics in TypeScript, and we created a function that returns a promise which has had its type asserted by us to make sure that the promise actually returns a specific data type, which was this API data interface that we created. But we've made this function called makeHTTP_call, and it's a little bit inflexible because it will always return a promise with this type of data. So how can we make this HTTP call function return any type of data while still actually performing the same task? Well, we do that by making the function itself generic, and we can pass in a type, and then the return type will match whatever type we've passed in. So the way we do this in TypeScript is to pass in the generic type when we're defining the function, and this looks a little bit strange with arrow functions, so I might change this to a function in just a second. But essentially use the angle brackets just before the function declaration, and then we get access to this particular type that's been passed into the function, which we can then reuse throughout the rest of the function. So we only really need to use this generic T type once in our response, because we're going to type the type of data that's actually returned within the promise. So the type doesn't actually get passed in as an argument, it's defined within the TypeScript code itself. And as you can see, we're doing that by putting the angle brackets just before we create the function call. So now this makeHTTP call function will accept a generic type and then return a promise with the same data type. So here, where we've got the call to make HTTP call at the moment, you can see that the response object that's in the then block is untyped. So we've not really got access to any of the properties that are available to us on it. So the way we specify what type of data we want to use within our makeHTTP call, within our generic, is to put some angle brackets just before the actual function call itself, or at least where the parentheses provide the arguments, and then we pass in the type of data that we want to use. So in this case, we're going to use API data, which is the interface that we've got up here. And then now in our response object, we should find that that's been typed, and we've got again the IntelliSense and the type safe checking for all of the properties inside of the API data interface. So by making the HTTP call function generic, we can actually use any type of data. So if we're making different API calls to different endpoints and the data is different, then we can simply provide a different interface in the call to the function, and that will be substituted here when we're calling the generic function. So let's say we've got another interface, which is something completely different. So let's say it's API authorization, for example. So maybe this is a call to a login function or something. And it might have something like status, which is a string, and also a message to let the system know whether or not it was successful or not. It doesn't really matter what the interface is, just so we've got something different from our API data. So now we can pick up that interface here, and when we're making the HTTP call, so say it's a different URL that we're actually accessing, so it might be something like login, for example. Now, when the response object is returned from the promise, you can see that the type of that response is API authorization, which is that interface we just created. And you can see we've got access to the properties of message and status. So there you go, this is just a quick example of how you might use generics to create a generic function which accepts different types of interfaces or types of data, and how you can use that generic type within either your return type, or it can be used other places within the function as well to type the data that's used within inside of the function call. So that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.